Tanya, for the 9th day of Tammuz, is in Igeres HaTshuva, the beginning of Perek Beis. In the first Perek, the Alter Rebbe explained that the essence of Tshuva is not fasting for sins, over sins that were committed, but rather Tshuva means abandoning the sin, discontinuing the sin. And even those sins which we are told in the Gemara that Tshuva alone is not enough, but that in addition to the Tshuva there also has to be suffering. Those sins, for example, that are punishable by death. So the suffering there doesn't mean that the person should take upon himself suffering, such as fasting, but rather the suffering comes from above, and that is God's way of cleansing the soul. But not that fasting and making yourself suffer is an integral or necessary part of tshuva. Now, Perek Beis. All of this, the above mentioned. The fact that tshuva itself is effective without fasting, that is in reference to the forgiveness of the sin. That with the fasting alone, the forgiveness is complete. He is completely forgiven. For having violated the commandment of the king. And that is, when he does a complete tshuva, the sin is completely forgiven. And not a word or a half a word of the sin is mentioned on the day of judgment. That he should, God forbid, be punished for it in the world to come. Rather, niftar legamri min hadin ba'elam haba. As a result of the tshuva, he is completely innocent and guiltless in the world to come. But in order for the person to be as willingly accepted by God, and he should be wanted and precious before God as he was before the sin, that God should have pleasure from the service that this person who sinned and did tshuva is serving God after the sin. The days of the Beis Hamikdash, after the tshuva, he would have to bring a sacrifice. In addition to the tshuva, the person would bring a sacrifice, not in order to gain forgiveness, but in order to be accepted and as welcome by God as he was before. And this was true even for the failure to do a positive mitzvah, which certainly doesn't have the death penalty. With few exceptions, positive mitzvahs don't have death penalty. And even then he had to bring a carbon, as the sages explain in Teiras Kayanim, al posuk, on the verse, that when a person brings the carbon elo, that brings forgiveness for having violated or failing to do a positive mitzvah. As the Gemara says in the first Perek of the Zvachim, the Eila mechaperes al mitzvahs say that the carbon Eila that was brought daily, that was to bring forgiveness for the failure to do a mitzvah. Vehi, and what is the purpose of this Eila, of this carbon? He deiran li'achasha tshuva v'nimchalei ha'enesh. It is a gift that one brings to God after he does tshuva and after he is forgiven and the punishment is rescinded. As for example, a person who went against the king, who angered the king, and then pleaded for forgiveness and gained the forgiveness through intermediaries, Umochale, and the king forgives him. Afal pikein, even so, Sheleach deirenu min chalefanov, the person sends a present, a gift to the king, sheyisratze le'lires pnei hamelech, that he should be accepted willingly, that he should be able to come before the king and to see the king. So the forgiveness is one thing. After the forgiveness, there's also the desire to be as acceptable to the king as he was before, and this comes as a result of sending the gift. And in this case, the carbon oil, the sacrifice. The lotion mechaperes, and the expression mechaperes, where it says that the sacrifice brings forgiveness. And the verse that says that as a result of this karba, the God will be willingly accepting of this person, and he will be forgiven. And here we're saying that the karban doesn't bring forgiveness, but it brings acceptance, and forgiveness comes from tshuva. Ein zu kaporas nafshe. So these expressions mechaperes and lechaper olav does not mean forgiveness for the person, for the soul. Elo lechaper lifnei Hashem liyes nachas ruach l'kainei. Not that it cleanses the soul, but that it cleanses the person before God. That all leftover, all remaining hesitations on God's part is removed, so that God can once again have pleasure from this person's service. As he says there in the Gemara, that after there was already a kapora, that's when he brings the carbon. So after there is forgiveness, that's when you bring the sacrifice. That the whole idea of the carbon is not that it should be for a forgiveness, but for a rotze, that God should be willing to accept the person again. So all of this is when we were bringing sacrifices in the times of Beis Hamikdash. That after the person did tshuva, in order to regain the standing that he had before, although he already has forgiveness, but to regain the standing, to be as precious to God as before, you brought a carbon. And now, now that we don't have sacrifices in order to win God's will and approval, so the fasting comes in the place of the carbon. As it says in the Gemara, that a person who is fasting should say a little prayer. And the prayer should be, that may the loss of flesh and blood that comes as a result of fasting, may this reduction and loss of weight be considered as if I brought myself for a sacrifice. So we see that fasting is like bringing a sacrifice. And that's why, because fasting is not for the purpose of gaining forgiveness, but rather for the purpose of becoming precious and acceptable to God, that God should have pleasure from our service of Him. That's why we find with many Tanoim v'Amiroyim, authors of the Mishnah and authors of the Gemara, shal dover kal, that on a very slight transgression, hoyu misanim tainiyes harbe mi'ed, that they would fast an incredible amount of fasts for what seems to be a very insignificant sin. So if the fasting was in order to gain forgiveness for a sin, then there'd be no justification for all these fasts over an insignificant and slight transgression. Kamari, for example, we find that Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, Shahaya Mate, Shetahi Pora Yetza B'Ritzua Sheben Karnei B'Shabbos, Rebbe Elazar ben Azariah, who was an authority on his own right in halacha, ruled that the cow that belongs to a Jew is allowed to carry or wear the belt or the strap that hung between its horns he's allowed to wear it on Shabbos. You're not supposed to make your animal work on Shabbos, but this strap, Elazar ben Azariah said that you're allowed to wear it. The cow is allowed to carry it. But the sages, in other words, the majority opinion among the sages was that it's not allowed. And it happened one time that Yotza came that his neighbor's cow was carrying this strap on Shabbos, and Elazar ben Azariah did not try to stop it. And later he regretted not having stopped it, and he fasted in order to rectify it. And in order to correct it, he fasted for so long that his teeth became dark. And why was he fasting? Not because it was such a sin, but because he had not fulfilled and followed the ruling of his peers. Rabbi Yeshua, another example, was Rabbi Yeshua She'omar, who said, he disagreed with Beis Shammai, and he said, I'm embarrassed by what you say, and then he regretted this expression, the sharpness of his expression. He regretted it, and he fasted until his teeth became dark. Rav Huna, and a third case was with Rav Huna. That the strap of the tefillin was twisted, it was turned inside out, while he was wearing it. So he fasted 40 fasts. So we see that for a slight sin, they fasted an incredible amount of fasts. So it must be that the fast is not for the purpose of forgiveness. Forgiveness is much easier to attain for those kinds of things. And there's nothing really to forgive at all. So the fasting was not for forgiveness, but for closeness and acceptability, to be acceptable to God. And the reason that the Rebbe brings these three examples, so the Rebbe Shlita explains that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was a Kohen, and Rabbi Yeshua was a Levi, and Rav Huna was a Yisro from the tribe of Yehuda. And Kohen, Levi, Yisro correspond to thought, speech, and deed. And that's why we find that by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was the Kohen, who represents thought, his failure, his regret, was a regret of something that he thought, his thinking. He regretted his thinking, in that he didn't think to stop the animal from carrying the strap, which according to his friends was prohibited. Rabbi Yeshua, who is a Levi, who represents the level of speech, his regret was something that he had said, his expression. He used a very sharp and somewhat disrespectful expression towards Beis Shammai. So it was the words that he regretted. And Rav Huna, who was the Yisro corresponding to action, he regretted having the strap of the tefillin twisted, which is an act, not a thought, not a speech. And the idea is that this kind of cleansing that comes from fasting applies to the imperfections in speech, imperfections in thought, imperfections in action. The Kehena Rabbis, and we find many such examples among the sages where they fasted for what seems to be a very insignificant sin. And based on this idea that fasting is necessary even for slight sins, because it is not for the purpose of gaining forgiveness, rather it is for the purpose of cleansing through the suffering, just as the Karban in the time of the Beis Hamikdash was brought after the forgiveness was complete. So based on this, Limid Ha'arizal Talmidov Al-Pi Chochmas Ha'emes, the Arizal taught his students, based on Kabbalah, that there's a Mispah Hatzemes Lekama Avenis V'Chatoim, that there's a certain amount of fasts that are appropriate and necessary for different kinds of sin. even though those sins that he enumerates are not punishable by death. So we would think that only for sins that are punishable by death, concerning which we are told that tshuva itself, it delays the punishment, but the forgiveness is not complete until the person has suffered, and we would think that suffering means fasting. So Alter Rebbe says that fasting is not for the purpose of forgiveness. You don't need to fast in order to be forgiven. You don't need to suffer in order to be forgiven. What then is the purpose of the fasting, or of the korban, or in the times of the Beis HaMikdash? That's in order to make up for that suffering that was necessary for those sins that are forgiven only, are cleansed only after there is suffering. That's what we would think. So Alter Rebbe says, no, that's not true. First of all, the fasting is not to gain forgiveness. Second of all, there is fasting necessary even where forgiveness isn't. In other words, where the sin is very slight. Still, there is a need for fasting, because fasting is not only for forgiveness, it is also for elevating, for getting closer to God. And therefore, even for sins that are not punishable by death, and for those sins you don't need to suffer, even so, there is a certain amount of fasts necessary. So we see that the fasts are not for the purpose of suffering, but for the purpose of gaining closeness and acceptability to God. Kamei, for example, al-hakas, for losing your temper, for getting angry, the Arizal recommends Kuf Nun Aleph Tainies, 151 fasts. Fasting 151 days. Vafilu Alisud Rabbanon, and even on a rabbinic violation, it seems that getting angry is a Torah violation. Even for a rabbinic violation, Kamei Stam Yenom, as for example wine made by a non-Jew, even though it wasn't used for idols, which is a rabbinic prohibition, Isana Ayin Gimel Tainiyes, so it says in the Kabbalah that a person should fast 73 fasts for drinking wine that was made by a non-Jew. And also for not doing a positive mitzvah that was instituted by the sages. Kamei Tefillah, as for example, davening in its set times, in the appropriate times. Because davening itself could be that it is a biblical commandment, a deraisa. But the time of davening is certainly a positive mitzvah from the sages, and if he fails to daven on time, he should fast 61 fasts. So we see that even for things that are not punishable by death, very far from it, still there is a need to the fasting in order to regain the acceptability as it was before. Derech klal, generally speaking, seid hatainis, the act of fasting, his segula niflo, his galus ratzon elyon baruch hu, is a great help in bringing out and revealing God's will, in moving God's will, making God willing. Kamei hakarban, just as the sacrifices were, shene'emar bei, concerning the sacrifices, it says reyach necheach laHashem, that the sacrifice was a pleasure, was pleasant to God and a pleasure to God. As he says in the Navi Yeshaya, is this what you call a fast and a day of willingness before God? So we see from this, so we see that if the fast was an appropriate one, the Navi is saying that the fast at that time was inappropriate. Do you call this a fast? So we see that if it was a fast, what would the result be? It would be a day of willingness before God, that God's will would be moved to do whatever it is that the Jews needed or asking for at the time. So in Perek Beis, the Alter Rebbe further establishes that fasting is not an essential part of forgiveness, Rather, the fasting takes the place of the karban, of the sacrifice, and the sacrifice itself was also brought after the person had already gained forgiveness through tshuva. And the purpose of the karban, the purpose of the fasting, is to regain favor, not just forgiveness, but favor in God's eyes, that God should take pleasure from our service. In the Hayom Yom of today, the 9th of Tammuz, the Rebbe writes as follows: all Jewish parents who need a special help, who need special assistance and a blessing for their children, in reference to their children and all the children's needs, this most certain method of gaining that help from above is to support those who study Torah.